Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to find a stranger standing at the foot of your bed, a knife pressed against your throat, a voice whispering threats against everyone you love. Now imagine you are 14 years old. This is not a nightmare. This is not a movie. This is the true story of Elizabeth Smart, and what happened next would captivate an entire nation, challenge everything we think we know about survival, and ultimately reveal the extraordinary strength that lives within the human spirit. But here is what most people never talk about. The real horror was not the kidnapping itself. It was what came after. 9 months of unimaginable terror, hiding in plain sight, walking among ordinary people who had no idea they were looking at one of the most famous missing children in America. How does someone survive that? How does a young girl hold on to hope when everything has been taken from her? And how, against all odds, does she not only survive but emerge to become one of the most powerful voices for victims in modern history? Stay with me through this entire story, because the ending is something you will never forget. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story of incredible resilience, someone who needs proof that the darkest chapter does not have to be the final chapter, share this video with them right now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories like this one. Because what Elizabeth Smart endured and overcame is something the world needs to remember. The year was 2002. Salt Lake City, Utah, was a place where people still left their doors unlocked and children played freely in tree-lined neighborhoods. The Smart family lived in a beautiful home in the Federal Heights area, a close-knit community where everyone knew their neighbors. Ed and Lois Smart had 6 children, and Elizabeth was their eldest daughter. She was a bright, musical girl who played the harp with a passion that seemed beyond her years. She loved horses, she loved her family, and she loved the predictable rhythm of her sheltered life. But on the night of June 5, 2002, that rhythm would be shattered forever. It was around 2 in the morning when Elizabeth felt something pulling her from sleep. At first, she thought she was dreaming. Then she felt the cold steel of a blade against her skin. A man stood beside her bed, his face partially obscured in the darkness. His voice was calm, almost eerily so, as he told her to get up quietly or he would kill her entire family. Elizabeth's 9-year-old sister Mary Katherine was sleeping in the same room, just feet away. Elizabeth could see her sister's form in the other bed, could feel the weight of the decision being forced upon her. Scream and risk everyone dying. Stay silent and hope to survive. She chose silence. She chose to protect her family. In that moment, a 14-year-old girl made a choice that would haunt her for months to come, a choice born of love and terror and the impossible mathematics of survival. The man led her out of her bedroom, through a window that had been cut open, and into the night. Elizabeth was barefoot, wearing red pajamas, walking into the unknown with a stranger who called himself a prophet of God. The man's name was Brian David Mitchell, though Elizabeth would not learn this immediately. To her, he was simply a monster wearing the mask of religious righteousness. He had actually worked at the Smart home months earlier, hired by Ed Smart to do some roof repair. He had seen Elizabeth then, and in his twisted mind, he had decided she was meant to be his. He had watched the family, studied their routines, and planned this abduction with chilling precision. His wife, Wanda Barzee, was waiting nearby, ready to help imprison the girl who would become their captive for the next 9 months. They walked for hours that night, climbing into the mountains above Salt Lake City to a crude campsite hidden among the trees. Elizabeth was exhausted, terrified, and completely disoriented. When they finally stopped, she was told she would be Brian Mitchell's second wife, a divine calling that she had no choice but to accept. The first so-called marriage ceremony was performed that very night, with Wanda Barzee serving as witness. What followed was the first of countless assaults, the beginning of a captivity so horrific that most people cannot bear to hear the details. But Elizabeth survived. And understanding how she survived, understanding the psychological warfare she endured and the strategies she employed to stay alive, is essential to understanding the magnitude of her eventual triumph. In those first hours, she made a decision. She would live. No matter what they did to her body, no matter what lies they told her about her family abandoning the search, No matter how hopeless everything seemed, she would find a way to stay alive. That decision, made in the darkest moment of her young life, would become her anchor through everything that followed. Meanwhile, back at the Smart family home, Mary Katherine had done something extraordinary. She had pretended to be asleep while her sister was taken, frozen with fear, but recording everything she saw and heard in her young mind. It would take her months to fully process what she had witnessed, but eventually, her memories would help save her sister's life. As dawn broke over Salt Lake City, the Smart family woke to discover Elizabeth was gone. The window screen was cut. There were no other signs of struggle. Their daughter had simply vanished into the night. The search for Elizabeth Smart became one of the largest and most intensive missing child investigations in American history. Within hours of her disappearance, police and volunteers flooded the Salt Lake City area. Flyers with Elizabeth's face were posted on every surface. Her photograph appeared on national news broadcasts. The entire nation learned her name, memorized her features, and prayed for her safe return. But while searchers combed the mountains and investigators chased leads across the country, Elizabeth was hidden just 3 miles from her home. The camp where Brian Mitchell held Elizabeth captive was primitive and remote, accessible only by hiking through dense forest. He had prepared for this, stockpiling food and supplies, creating a shelter hidden from casual observation. Elizabeth was tethered to a tree with a cable around her ankle, unable to escape even if she had known which direction to run. Mitchell and Barzy had created their own twisted world, complete with rules and rituals that revolved around Mitchell's delusions of being a religious prophet. He called himself Emmanuel and claimed that God had commanded him to take Elizabeth as his plural wife. Every day was an exercise in psychological torture. Mitchell would preach for hours, reading from scriptures and his own handwritten manifesto, a rambling document that blended religious imagery with disturbing demands. He controlled when Elizabeth could eat, when she could sleep, when she could speak. Any hint of disobedience was met with threats against her family. He told her repeatedly that if she tried to escape, he would return to the Smart home and kill everyone she loved. He described in graphic detail what he would do to her younger siblings. Elizabeth learned to survive by becoming invisible within her own mind. She followed their rules. She answered to the name they gave her. She wore the robes they made her wear. Outwardly, she appeared to be a compliant member of their strange household. But inside, she never stopped being Elizabeth Smart. She never stopped believing that somehow, someday, she would go home. This internal preservation was her greatest act of resistance, even if the outside world could not see it. The physical conditions of her captivity were brutal. The mountain camp offered little shelter from the elements. When temperatures dropped, Elizabeth shivered through the nights. When rains came, she sat in mud. She was given minimal food, often the scraps left over after Mitchell and Barzy had eaten their fill. She lost weight rapidly, her young body weakening under the strain of malnutrition and constant stress. But still, she survived. Perhaps most insidious was the isolation. Mitchell controlled all information about the outside world, feeding Elizabeth lies designed to destroy her hope. He told her that her family had stopped searching. He claimed they had given statements to the press saying they never wanted her back, that she had brought shame upon them. He showed her fabricated newspaper clippings suggesting the search had been called off. Every piece of disinformation was calculated to make her feel abandoned, to convince her that staying with Mitchell was her only option. But Elizabeth held on to doubt. Something inside her refused to believe that her parents had given up. She remembered her mother's love, her father's devotion, the warmth of her family home. Those memories became her secret resistance, a flame she kept burning even when everything around her was darkness. She did not argue with Mitchell's lies. That would have been dangerous, but she did not believe them either. As summer turned to fall, the search for Elizabeth Smart continued unabated. Ed and Lois Smart refused to give up, appearing on television programs, organizing community searches, and keeping their daughter's name in the public consciousness. They followed every lead, no matter how thin. They endured the agony of false hopes and dead ends. They fought against the assumption that their daughter was probably already dead. Their persistence was remarkable, a testament to parental love that refuses to accept the unacceptable. In October of 2002, something unexpected happened. Mary Katherine, Elizabeth's younger sister, finally accessed a memory she had been suppressing for months. She remembered the voice of the man who had taken Elizabeth. She remembered where she had heard it before. It was the man who had worked on their roof, the quiet laborer who had called himself Emmanuel. When she told her parents, when she described the man she had seen in the darkness of that June night, the investigation finally had a breakthrough. But here is where the story takes a heartbreaking turn. Despite Mary Katherine's revelation, the lead was not immediately pursued with the urgency it deserved. Some investigators were skeptical of a young girl's memory. Some were focused on other suspects. Precious time was lost while Elizabeth remained in captivity, moving now from the mountain camp to various locations around the region. If this moment makes you feel frustrated, if you are wondering how such a crucial lead could be overlooked, leave a comment below telling me your thoughts. Because understanding how the system failed Elizabeth is part of understanding how we can do better. The psychology of captivity is something most people never fully understand until they hear stories like Elizabeth's. Brian David Mitchell did not maintain control primarily through physical restraint. His most powerful weapon was psychological manipulation, a constant barrage of techniques designed to break Elizabeth's will and reshape her identity. Understanding these techniques helps us understand both the horror of what she endured and the remarkable strength of her survival. Mitchell used religious authority as his primary tool of control. He presented himself as a prophet receiving direct communication from God. Every command, every cruelty, every assault was framed as divine will. To resist was to resist God himself. For a young girl raised in a faith-based household, this manipulation struck at the core of her identity. Mitchell twisted familiar scriptures, using Elizabeth's own religious background as a weapon against her. He created an entire theology to justify his crimes, casting himself as a holy man and Elizabeth as his chosen bride. The concept of learned helplessness became central to Elizabeth's experience. Day after day, she was shown that resistance was futile and dangerous. Attempts to assert herself were met with punishment or renewed threats. Gradually, the logical part of her brain adapted to survival by limiting behaviors that triggered negative consequences. This was not weakness. This was her mind doing exactly what minds are designed to do, finding a way to survive impossible circumstances. Every victim who has experienced prolonged captivity describes similar adaptations. Mitchell also employed isolation to reinforce his control. Elizabeth was kept away from any outside contact. She had no access to news, no way to know that the entire country was looking for her. Her universe shrank to the size of their makeshift camp, with Mitchell and Barzy as her only companions and sources of information. In such isolation, even the cruelest captor can become a lifeline, the only source of food, shelter, and human contact. This psychological dependency, sometimes called trauma bonding, is a survival mechanism, not a choice. But Elizabeth never fully succumbed. Within the prison of her circumstances, she maintained a sanctuary in her mind. She remembered who she was. She remembered who loved her. She thought about her harp, her horse, her siblings, her parents. She replayed happy memories like films, escaping mentally when physical escape was impossible. She developed what psychologists would later describe as an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization, putting the trauma in one box while keeping her essential self safe in another. As months passed, Elizabeth was forced to participate in activities designed to further break her spirit. She was made to drink alcohol and take drugs against her will, substances that Mitchell used to keep her compliant and confused. She was forced to watch pornography, part of Mitchell's twisted attempt to normalize his abuse. Through all of this, she maintained her internal resistance, following orders when necessary while never losing sight of who she really was. The winter of 2002 was particularly brutal. Mitchell moved their camp several times, always seeking to avoid detection. Elizabeth was forced to hike through snow and freezing temperatures, inadequately dressed and barely fed. She developed health problems that went untreated. She prayed constantly, not always believing her prayers would be answered, but refusing to stop hoping. That persistence, that stubborn refusal to give up on God, even when it seemed God had given up on her, would later become central to her message of resilience. In February of 2003, a development occurred that would prove crucial. America's Most Wanted, the television program dedicated to capturing fugitives, aired a segment featuring a composite sketch of Elizabeth's suspected abductor. The sketch was based on Mary Katherine's description of the man she had seen. It was the first time the public had a face to connect with the crime. Ed Smart had pushed hard for this exposure, convinced that someone somewhere would recognize the man. He was right, though the resolution was still weeks away. Meanwhile, Mitchell made a decision that was either arrogant or desperate or both. He decided to bring Elizabeth out of hiding and travel with her publicly. Perhaps he believed that enough time had passed, that people had forgotten her face. Perhaps he thought his disguises were sufficient. He dressed Elizabeth in a veil and robes, covering everything but her eyes. He called her by her fake name and presented her as a member of his religious group. They began appearing in public, eating at restaurants, walking through towns, hiding in plain sight. This was simultaneously Elizabeth's greatest torment and her opportunity. She was walking among people who might recognize her, yet she was prevented from speaking or removing her veil. Mitchell's threats remained constant. If she tried to signal anyone, if she revealed herself, everyone she loved would die. She believed him. After months of torture and manipulation, she had no reason to think his threats were empty. So she walked beside her captor, invisible behind her veil, screaming silently for help that never came. The story of how Elizabeth Smart was finally recognized is one of those moments that feels almost too dramatic to be true. Yet every detail has been verified, every coincidence has been documented, and the outcome stands as proof that sometimes the universe arranges itself in favor of the innocent. It was March 12, 2003. Elizabeth had been missing for 9 months and 7 days. Mitchell, Barzy, and Elizabeth were in the town of Sandy, Utah, a suburb of Salt Lake City. They had been traveling through several states, spending time in California and returning to Utah despite the ongoing search. Mitchell was either supremely confident in his disguise or simply crazy enough to ignore the risk. Elizabeth was wearing her usual covering, multiple layers of robes, and a veil that revealed only her eyes. To casual observers, she appeared to be a member of some religious sect, unusual but not alarming. A couple named Rudy and Nancy Montoya were driving through Sandy when they spotted the 3 strange figures walking along the street. Something about them caught Nancy's attention. Maybe it was the way they walked. Maybe it was an instinct that defied explanation. Nancy had seen the segment on America's Most Wanted just the night before. She had studied the composite sketch of Elizabeth's abductor. Looking at the bearded man in robes, she felt a jolt of recognition. The Montoyas called police and followed the group at a distance, keeping them in sight until officers arrived. When police approached Mitchell and asked for identification, he gave a false name and a rambling explanation about his religious mission. Officers were uncertain whether they had a genuine lead or just an eccentric homeless man. Then they asked about the silent figure in the veil. They asked her to reveal her face. Elizabeth was trapped in a moment of impossible tension. Mitchell was right there, within arm's reach, capable of carrying out every threat he had made. 9 months of conditioning told her to remain silent, to protect her family by maintaining the lie. But something else was happening inside her, too. She could see the officers' uniforms, could sense that help was finally at hand. The battle between fear and hope played out in seconds that felt like hours. The officers were gentle but persistent. They asked the veiled figure her name. Mitchell answered for her, insisting she was his daughter. But the officers had been trained to be suspicious of exactly these situations. They asked Elizabeth directly, "Is your name Elizabeth Smart?" And in that moment, everything Mitchell had built began to crumble. Elizabeth did not answer immediately. She could not. The conditioning was too deep, the fear too present. But the officers continued to speak to her calmly, reassuring her that she was safe, that they were there to help. They told her that her family was looking for her, that her parents had never stopped searching. Slowly, Elizabeth began to cry. Slowly, she nodded. Yes, yes, she was Elizabeth Smart. The reunion that followed is almost impossible to describe without breaking down emotionally. Ed Smart was in a meeting when he received the call. He ran from the room, unable to contain his emotions. Lois Smart collapsed in relief. Within hours, Elizabeth was in the hospital being examined and evaluated, surrounded by the family that had never stopped believing she would return. Television cameras captured the nation's reaction, millions of people crying along with the Smarts, celebrating a miracle they had almost stopped hoping for. But the story was far from over. Elizabeth had survived her captivity, but now she would have to survive the aftermath. She would have to find a way to process what had happened to her. She would have to reclaim her identity from the months of systematic destruction. And she would have to decide what to do with the attention that was suddenly focused on her every move. The girl who had disappeared at 14 would have to figure out how to live again in a world that had changed while she was gone. Mitchell and Barzy were immediately taken into custody. The legal process that followed would take years, complicated by Mitchell's claims of religious immunity and questions about his mental competence. But for Elizabeth, the immediate concern was not punishment. It was survival of a different kind. She had to learn how to be Elizabeth again. The period following Elizabeth's rescue is less often discussed, but equally important to understanding her full story. Physical freedom was only the first step. The psychological journey back to wholeness would take years and require courage every bit as profound as what she had shown during her captivity. Elizabeth was 15 years old, and she was expected to somehow resume a normal teenage life. Her family protected her fiercely in those early months. They limited media access, screened visitors, and created a bubble of safety around their daughter. Elizabeth re-entered the private school she had attended before the kidnapping, though now she was famous in ways she had never wanted. Every student knew her story. Every teacher walked on eggshells around her. She had to navigate the strange experience of being simultaneously invisible and hyperly visible. Therapy was essential to Elizabeth's recovery, though she has spoken about how difficult it was to find therapists who understood the specific trauma of kidnapping and sexual assault. Many well-meaning professionals focused on the wrong things or pushed her to process memories before she was ready. Elizabeth learned to advocate for herself in therapeutic settings, seeking out practitioners who respected her pace and her agency. This advocacy would later inform her work helping other survivors. One of the most powerful moments in Elizabeth's recovery came through a conversation with her mother. Shortly after her return, Elizabeth was struggling with shame and despair. She felt dirty, broken, worthless. The assault she had endured made her question whether she had any value left. Her mother sat with her and offered a metaphor that would become central to Elizabeth's message. She compared Elizabeth to a delicate necklace that had been stolen and abused. The necklace was no less precious because of what had been done to it. Its value was intrinsic and unchangeable. This message, that a victim's worth is not diminished by what was done to them, became the cornerstone of Elizabeth's later advocacy. She had to believe it about herself before she could share it with others. And believing it required actively fighting against the messages Mitchell had planted in her mind. Every day was a battle against the voice that said she was ruined, that said no one could ever truly love her, that said she should be ashamed. She won that battle through persistence, through support, and through faith. Elizabeth returned to music, finding solace in the harp that had always been her passion. The instrument became a form of therapy, a way to express emotions that words could not capture. She also turned to her faith, wrestling with questions about God and suffering that many trauma survivors face. How could a loving God allow what had happened to her? Where was divine protection when she needed it most? These questions did not have easy answers, but Elizabeth found a way to maintain her faith while acknowledging its complexity. High school was a strange experience for Elizabeth. She tried to focus on normal teenage concerns, classes and friendships and dreams for the future, while carrying the weight of experiences most adults could not imagine. She found that some peers treated her differently, either avoiding her or seeking her out for the wrong reasons. True friendships were precious and rare. She learned to value the people who saw her as Elizabeth first and as a kidnapping survivor second. The legal process moved forward during these years, a constant reminder of what she had endured. Mitchell's defense team argued that he was mentally incompetent to stand trial, resulting in years of evaluations and hearings. Elizabeth had to endure the knowledge that her abuser was still alive, still receiving attention, still profiting in some sick way from his crimes. The wait for justice was agonizing. Yet Elizabeth was already beginning to transform her trauma into purpose. She started speaking publicly about her experiences, initially in controlled settings and later to larger audiences. Each time she told her story, she took back power that Mitchell had tried to steal. Each time she answered questions, she refused to let shame dictate her silence. She was terrified before every speaking engagement, but she showed up anyway. That showing up, despite the fear, is what courage really looks like. The trial of Brian David Mitchell finally began in November of 2010, more than 8 years after Elizabeth's kidnapping. It had taken that long to overcome defense arguments about Mitchell's mental state and establish that he was competent to stand trial. Elizabeth was now 23 years old, a college student at Brigham Young University, engaged to be married. She had built a life far beyond what Mitchell had tried to reduce her to. Now she would have to face him one more time. Entering the courtroom was one of the hardest things Elizabeth had ever done. Mitchell was there, sitting at the defense table, occasionally bursting into religious songs that disrupted the proceedings. He was removed from the courtroom multiple times for his outbursts, but even his absence was unsettling. His presence hung over everything, a reminder of the months of terror he had inflicted. Elizabeth had to summon every bit of strength to keep her composure. When Elizabeth took the stand to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Here was the girl who had survived, now a woman who refused to be silenced. She described her kidnapping in detail, her voice steady even when the content was horrifying. She described the assaults, the manipulation, the endless threats. She looked at the jury and made them understand what it meant to be held captive by a monster wearing a mask of religion. The defense tried to paint Mitchell as mentally ill, too disconnected from reality to be held responsible for his actions. But Elizabeth's testimony demonstrated the calculated nature of his crimes. He had chosen her months before the kidnapping. He had planned the abduction carefully. He had maintained control through deliberate psychological techniques. This was not a man lost in delusion. This was a predator who used religious rhetoric to justify his predation. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when Elizabeth was asked why she had not tried to escape, especially during the months when she was in public. The question was asked gently, without judgment, but it touched on something that haunted many people's understanding of the case. Why had she not run? Why had she not screamed for help in those restaurants and stores? Elizabeth's answer was honest and devastating. She explained the constant threats against her family. She described the psychological conditioning that had convinced her resistance was futile. She spoke about the shame and confusion she felt, the fear that no one would believe her or want her back. Her answer was not an excuse. It was an education, a window into the reality of captivity that most people could never understand from the outside. She had not failed to escape. She had survived in the only way that seemed possible. After 9 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for only 5 hours before returning a verdict. Brian David Mitchell was found guilty of kidnapping and transporting a minor across state lines for sexual purposes. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Wanda Barzee, who had been tried separately, received a sentence of 15 years and was released in 2018. Elizabeth spoke at Mitchell's sentencing hearing, addressing him directly for the first time since her rescue. Her words were measured but powerful. She told him that he had failed to break her. She told him that she had reclaimed her life and her identity. She told him that he would spend the rest of his existence in prison while she lived freely. There was no rage in her voice, only the quiet confidence of someone who had won a battle that lasted years. That moment in the courtroom was a crucial part of Elizabeth's healing. She had faced her monster and found that he had no power over her anymore. The testimony and the verdict were not just legal proceedings. They were affirmations that what had happened to her was wrong, that the world recognized as evil, that justice, imperfect as it might be, was still possible. The years following Mitchell's conviction saw Elizabeth Smart transform from survivor to advocate, from victim to voice. She completed her degree in music at Brigham Young University, married Matthew Gilmore, a Scottish man she had met doing missionary work in France, and began building the life that had once seemed impossible. But she also recognized that her story gave her a platform, and she was determined to use it. In 2011, Elizabeth founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, an organization dedicated to preventing crimes against children and supporting survivors. The foundation focuses on education, raising awareness about predatory behavior, and teaching children how to recognize and report abuse. It also works with law enforcement and policymakers to improve responses to missing children cases. Elizabeth brought her personal experience to every aspect of the organization, ensuring that survivor voices remained central to its mission. She became a commentator on missing children cases, appearing on national news programs to offer perspective informed by her own survival. When other children went missing, Elizabeth was often among the first to offer support to families, to advocate for continued searches, to remind the public that hope should never be abandoned. Her presence in these cases was a reminder that survival was possible, that captivity did not have to be the end of the story. Elizabeth also began speaking publicly about the specific challenges faced by sexual assault survivors. She challenged the shame and stigma that often silenced victims, speaking openly about her own experiences in ways that required tremendous courage. She addressed religious communities, urging them to support survivors rather than judging them. She spoke at universities, telling young people that their worth was not determined by what had been done to them. One of Elizabeth's most powerful messages centered on the metaphor of her worth. She often told audiences about a lesson she had learned about resilience. If you are a beautiful piece of gum and someone chews you up and spits you out, are you less valuable? Society might say yes, but that answer is wrong. Your value is inherent. Nothing that happens to you can change your fundamental worth. This message resonated with survivors around the world, offering hope and validation to those who had been taught to feel ashamed. Elizabeth also advocated for policy changes to improve how the criminal justice system treated kidnapping and sexual assault cases. She supported legislation strengthening sentences for child abusers and improving resources for victims. She testified before Congress, bringing her personal story to bear on national policy debates. Her advocacy helped ensure that the lessons of her case would translate into systemic improvements. The publication of her memoir, My Story, in 2013 brought Elizabeth's experiences to an even wider audience. The book was painfully honest about what she had endured, sparing neither herself nor her readers from the difficult truths of her captivity. Critics praised its power and authenticity. Readers found hope in its pages. The book became a bestseller and introduced new generations to Elizabeth's story. Through all of this, Elizabeth maintained her commitment to living fully. She and Matthew started a family, welcoming 3 children who would grow up knowing their mother's strength firsthand. She continued pursuing her music, performing at events, and sharing the art that had helped save her soul during the darkest days. She traveled, she laughed, she lived. Every day of normalcy was a victory against the forces that had tried to destroy her. Today, more than 2 decades after that terrifying night in June of 2002, Elizabeth Smart stands as one of the most powerful advocates for survivors in the world. She has spoken to millions of people across dozens of countries. She has influenced policies that protect children from predators. She has given voice to those who were taught to stay silent. And she has proven, through the living example of her life, that trauma does not have to define your destiny. Her story carries lessons that extend far beyond the specific horror of kidnapping. Elizabeth teaches us about the power of hope in hopeless situations. She teaches us about the slow, difficult work of reclaiming identity after it has been attacked. She teaches us about the importance of believing survivors, of understanding the complex psychological dynamics that operate in abusive situations. She teaches us that healing is possible even when wounds are deep. Perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth teaches us about the choice to use pain for purpose. She could have retreated into privacy after her rescue. No one would have blamed her. She had already endured more than most people could imagine. But she chose visibility. She chose to tell her story over and over, even when telling it was painful, because she knew that her voice could help others. That choice, that transformation of personal trauma into public service, is one of the most profound forms of courage. Elizabeth's message to survivors is simple but revolutionary. You are not what happened to you. You are not damaged goods. You are not responsible for the evil that was done to you. Your worth is not negotiable, not diminishable, not subject to the actions of predators. You have the right to tell your story, to seek justice, to heal at your own pace, to live fully despite what you have endured. These truths, spoken from a woman who has lived them, carry power that abstract advice never could. To those who have never experienced such trauma, Elizabeth offers different lessons. Believe survivors when they speak. Understand that captivity dynamics are complex and that victims often cannot simply escape. Support rather than judge. Pay attention to the children in your community. Report concerns rather than assuming someone else will. Small actions of vigilance can prevent future tragedies. Elizabeth still thinks about those 9 months sometimes. She still carries scars that will never fully heal. But she carries them as a warrior carries battle wounds, as proof of what she survived rather than marks of shame. She has built a beautiful life surrounded by people who love her. She has found purpose in her pain. She has refused to let Brian David Mitchell have the last word in her story. And that refusal is the heart of everything. Elizabeth Smart was supposed to disappear. She was supposed to be broken. She was supposed to become a statistic, a tragedy, a cautionary tale. Instead, she became a beacon. Instead, she became a voice. Instead, she became proof that the human spirit can withstand almost anything and emerge not just intact but stronger. When Elizabeth speaks now, she often returns to the theme that has defined her post-captivity life. We cannot always control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. We cannot undo the evil that exists in the world, but we can choose to fight it. We cannot erase our scars, but we can decide what they mean. In making these choices, day after day, we claim the victory that our abusers tried to steal. If you have stayed with this story until the end, you understand why Elizabeth Smart matters. Not just because of what was done to her, but because of what she has done since. Her life is a testament to resilience, a roadmap for healing, a challenge to everyone who has ever felt destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. She walked out of hell and built a heaven. She refused to disappear. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you will be here when we tell more stories of impossible survival and incredible triumph. Because Elizabeth Smart is not unique in her strength. All around us, survivors are fighting battles we cannot see, claiming victories we never hear about. Their stories deserve to be told. Their courage deserves to be witnessed. And their lessons deserve to be learned. This is the story of the girl who refused to disappear. This is the story of Elizabeth Smart. And this, against all odds, is a story with a happy ending.